So when Nixon was talking about drugs in the 70s, the drugs that were seen as problems by Nixon were marijuana, cocaine, and things like acid and mushrooms. But then, in the 1980s, American inventiveness came up with a new way to process coca. Cook it and make crack rock. Coca, you know, is a Bolivian plant. And Bolivian people roll up the leaf and put it in their gum and just kind of suck on a leaf all day. And it gives them a really mild kind of narcotic high. And so it's not the people who actually grew it who realized they could process it into a powder and snort it up their nose, or take that powder and cook it into a rock. Those are American innovations.
Yeah.
Crack scared the hell out of people in the 1980s. It seemed like crack appeared from out of nowhere, and it seemed to be more addictive than other drugs. That belief is still very much with us as a society, but the most recent drug research shows it's actually not true. That crack is no more addictive than powdered cocaine. But you wouldn't have thought that turning on your TV in the 1980s. And when the media portrayed the crack epidemic, as they called it, it was depicted as a problem in the cities, in black neighborhoods. It was depicted as a black problem. But, in fact, if you looked at America's crack users, which maybe you might not want to look at America's crack users, but if you did, well, 38% of the crack users are black. But 52% of them, the majority of the crack users, are white people. Are black people, then, more likely to use crack than white people?
No.
Yes.
Actually, yes.
Because what percentage of the population is black?
13.
13, right? So if they used crack at an equal level, 13% of the users would be crack people. I mean, would be black people. Gosh, I almost wish we could re-record that. We'll just keep going. So you got that then to understand it. Think of it this way. Black people are more likely to use crack, but they are not the majority of the crack users. Well then, look at how people are locked up for crack.
Oh, that's what's up.
90% of the people put in prison for crack
And they probably
are
have-
black.
And they haven't, some of them probably are innocent.
Sure. Where did white people go to get their crack?
Black neighborhoods?
They went to black neighborhoods.
Ah.
And then they bring the crack back to their home, right? And the police don't go to arrest people there. They go to the black neighborhoods and arrest people. And the kind of frenzy, the fear over crack was so severe that Congress passed federal laws that said the penalty for crack, the prison term, would be 100 times longer than the prison term for powdered cocaine. 100 times longer. So if you had an ounce of crack and an ounce of powdered cocaine, you're getting 100 years for the crack, and I'm getting 1 year for the powder.
What?
Yeah,
So basically life sentences.
right. It's people whose entire lives are going to be spent in a prison because they smoked a crack rock. This is from one study in one particular city, Baltimore. And they looked at juvenile arrests before the crack epidemic and 10 years later. And if you look at those numbers down there, those are the numbers of white and black people, juveniles, arrested for drugs. And so before crack, there were 15 white juveniles, right, and 86 black juveniles arrested. And 10 years later, look at that. In the entire city of Baltimore, there were 13 white teenagers arrested and 1,304 black teenagers.
Isn't Baltimore mostly African American?
It is, yeah.
So that's not a good model to use.
What's that?
Is it? No, never.
And then, so this is getting arrested, right? This is just who the police arrest. Then, of course, there's going to be a trial, right? And so other studies showed that if you took a black person and a white person, same age, arrested with the same drug, the black person was 7 times more likely to go to prison than the white person. 7 times more likely to go to prison. And weirdly, the judge and the jury in many of these cases didn't think there was any racism involved. Instead, the way it usually works in people's heads is like this. There's a 17-year-old white kid on trial for some drug possession, and people on the jury think, he's a good kid, he just made a mistake, and if we send him to prison, we're going to ruin his life. But the 17-year-old black kid arrested on the same drug charge, what do people on the jury think? What's he headed for?
Crime.
He's headed for a life of crime. We need to get him off the streets. So what this really set off is the greatest wave of locking people up in the history of the United States. Look at the number of people in America's prisons. And it really stays from the beginning of the 1900s all the way to the beginning of the drug war at almost the same level. And that's where Nixon begins the war on drugs. And look at what has happened to the number of people in prisons. Today, there are more than 2.5 million Americans in prisons. The United States is home to 5% of the world's people, and yet 25% of all of the world's people in prison are in United States prisons. The United States has more people locked up than communist China or any oppressive regime in the world you can think of. And the majority of the people in America's prisons are there for non-violent drug crimes. They never hurt anybody, they had a drug, or they sold a drug. By the 1990s, the NAACP had come to see the drug war as one of the biggest civil rights issues in the country, as had lots of civil rights groups. This billboard here is, of course, actually put up by the NAACP, right? Trying to get people to pay attention to the issue. A victory in kind of trying to roll back the war on drugs came during Obama's first term as president, when Congress voted to reduce the penalties for crack, so that they were now only 18 times more harsh than the penalties for powder. That may still seem kind of crazy, but compared to what it was, remember, 100 to 1, 18 to 1 seems more rational. Today, people are more likely to go to prison when charged with many drug possession charges than they are when charged with rape or armed robbery. And often, people convicted of crimes like rape and armed robbery serve less time than nonviolent drug users. Of course, the war on drugs is kind of now, apparently around the country, starting to roll back so quickly, I don't even have a new slide for it. But the war on drugs is most weakening at what has always been the war on drugs' weakest, most absurd point. Which drug? Marijuana. Right. And it's become harder and harder for drug warriors to lump marijuana in with crack and meth and other drugs. There are too many young people who've realized that they've been lied to and that marijuana is not crack. And so now, of course, we have this medical marijuana movement spreading, and
Yeah.
2 states who've actually legalized it. Things are changing quickly. And of course, the hope from civil rights perspectives is that eventually we reach a point where we stop locking up people who used an illegal drug, especially if we only enforce those laws in the neighborhoods where Black and now Latino people live. Actually, I guess one last important thing here is, around this country, what are the areas with the greatest concentrations of people using drugs?
Cities, actually.
No? College campuses. College campuses and the kind of off-campus housing right around the college campus.
Oh.
And yet, is that where the government puts its resources into enforcing drug laws?
No.
No. Because those people are seen as people who are just experimenting, you know? Slap on the wrist. You know, our class is about civil rights. And the changes of the last 50 years are much of it about culture. And so American culture changed rapidly and dramatically. So that, you know, in the 1980s, you started to get this new phenomenon of interracial buddy movies, like 48 Hours and Trading Places. The biggest stars in music were Black people in much of the 1980s. There were, around the country, millions of little white kids who had Michael Jackson posters in their rooms. Back when he was Black Michael Jackson, you know, before the very end. As the 1990s ended and the 21st century began, the greatest golfer in the world was Black. Golf was the greatest symbol of white privilege in sports. And now the best golfer in the world was Black. And there were some people who at the turn of the 21st century saw as an incredible sign of racial progress the acceptance of Eminem into the hip-hop world. Some people, I would disagree with those people, even said that Eminem was the greatest rapper on the planet. And the greatest golfer on the planet was a Black person. And this seemed to many people, right beside each other, a great statement on the possibilities of a multicultural America. And look down here, where they ask people this poll question every year: would you vote for a Black person as president? And by the end of the century, it was almost 90% of Americans who said, yeah, if it was the right person from my party, I would vote for a Black person. And yet, all through the 80s and 90s, when Black people actually ran for president, people didn't vote for them. So generically, they said, oh yeah, sure, I would do that. Then they just didn't actually do it. But in 2008, Barack Obama managed to get the Democratic nomination and then win. The majority of white Americans did not vote for him, but lots of them did. And some said that Barack Obama's election symbolized really the end of racism. That turned out to be way too optimistic. Instead, any kind of impartial observer would have to recognize that Obama has been treated in ways that no other president ever has. No other president has had a systematic effort to deny that they were American. That has only been directed at Barack Obama. No other president has seen the opposing party refuse to work with them at all on anything. No other president has seen the opposing party try to completely shut down the government and do nothing rather than cooperate with the president. Weirdly, maybe not weirdly, maybe predictably, racism in America has made a comeback since the election of Barack Obama. In the election of 2012, when Barack Obama ran for a second term, the Republicans brought back disfranchisement as a coordinated political strategy. Remember at the turn of the 1900s how they created poll taxes and literacy tests? Well, now there were ID laws, and former felons denied the right to vote. So think this through for just a second. A criminal justice system that enforces drug laws disproportionately on black people, makes those black people into convicted felons, and then when they get out of prison, they can't vote.
Something's wrong.
Right.
That's scary.
And none of this is accidental. It's strategy. Strategy by people who don't want black people to vote. And if you look around the country here, that is the percentage around the country of black men, just black people disfranchised in that state. And you look at some of these states, we're talking about 14, 15, 19% of the black people in that state who are disfranchised.
It's 24, 49.
Yeah, Iowa, there are 4 black people and one of them can't vote. I'm just kidding. But you get the idea.
Yeah.
So, lots of progress, problems remain.